All right, so this is the test review for Unit 7 over Africa. And so, just like every other review, I'm going to go through all the main topics you'll see on the test. So, one of the big things we talked about in Africa was desertification, and this is occurring mainly along the Sahel, the southern part of the Sahara Desert, where the desert is expanding. And it's expanding, a lot of it is human processes. So, livestock raising, which creates overgrazing, which the root systems get taken out of the ground, and so it's easier for the desert to spread at that point. It's harder for other plants and stuff to take root and to get in there. And then, of course, also you have like things like soil compaction, which again is from livestock, where the soil gets compacted and oxygen cannot reach the root systems of the plants in order for them to grow. And then, of course, we got the problem of urbanization. So as Africa is losing farmland, and a lot of their farmland is used for cash crops, you got more and more people moving to cities, and you have tons of people being born. And so that's what really puts the pressure on the availability of food and the lack thereof, which creates a lot of issues with starvation and just overall lack of food and nutrition. All right, and then also, HIV is a huge problem. AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. It's about 60% of all the people that have AIDS are in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a big issue there. Mainly, well, there's several reasons. You don't have safe sex practices. It's a lack of education and understanding how AIDS works. And then it's also, you got a lot of men that leave home and go work hundreds of miles away, and they're away from home for months and months. And they'll end up, sleeping with a prostitute or something like that and contracting AIDS, and then they go back home, and then AIDS is then spread, or HIV is then spread over to their spouse and stuff like that. So it keeps spreading because of that. All right, so of course, remember how to measure HDI, Human Development Index. So looking at things like life expectancy, per capita, GNP, and GDP, things like that give you indicators on how a country is doing. All right, and then we also talked about how Africa is an incredibly diverse continent. It's the most diverse continent on Earth. There are thousands of different ethnic groups. There's over 3,000 languages spoken throughout Africa. And of course, this is going to create breeding ground for conflicts. And so genocides, civil wars, all sorts of things go on throughout Africa. And a lot of it, of course, was created by the borders that Europe created in the Berlin Conference, which I'll get to here in a minute. All right, and then, of course, the most important economic activity in Africa is farming. We talked about how 66% of Africans farm, and you should know, of course, your primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary levels of economic activity, which has been pretty much on every test. So know, where things like that fall. And then we also talked about the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River. At least you should have watched the video from the notes about that. But we talked about that dam and some of the issues that's caused, and of course the reasons why they created it. So they created it in order to have steady water supply and stuff like that for Egypt. But the problem is it took away farmland, and then of course created a breeding ground for mosquitoes in the region. Of course, this is where we get West Nile virus from. All right, then the Berlin Conference. So again, the Berlin Conference, back in the 1800s when Africa was being colonized by European countries, not every European country had, a fair amount of colonies, basically, compared to the other. And so they met in Berlin and pulled out a map of Africa and then divided up Africa among European countries to avoid a war in Europe. And so, of course, they didn't consider Africa and the different ethnic groups they had and how they got along and things like that. They just didn't care. And so this is going to help create the problems that we see, like with the Rwandan genocide. All right, and then, of course, there's all sorts of diseases in Africa besides AIDS. We've got malaria, TB, cholera, things like that. And this spreads, a lot of it is, you've got, obviously, lack of education. Poverty is very widespread and hard to control and things like that. And then, of course, unstable governments. If you don't have a stable government, you can't improve education. Obviously, poverty is not going to be fixed at all if you don't have a stable government and stuff like that. All right, and then if the reason why malaria is more common in Africa compared to other regions of the world, a lot of it has to do with the fact that most of Africa lies within the tropics. And just in general, in the tropics, you're going to see many more diseases and stuff like that. And there's actually a huge, I say huge, there's a big theory among geographers and historians saying that pretty much all countries that lie in the tropics, that the reason why they haven't done well economically overall, actually a lot has to do with the fact of where they're located, because there's so many diseases, because they live in the tropics and there is no winter to kill these insects and these diseases that spread. It keeps them from ever really developing fully. Whereas in all your rich, powerful countries are mainly in the temperate zones like the United States. So, I mean, that has a big impact on them being able to develop, and your people are getting sick all the time. All right, and then tying in colonialization and ethnic tensions, of course, Rwanda is a great example of that. You should definitely understand Rwanda well by now. Same thing with Sudan. So where you got ethnic groups, you put them together, like in the case of Rwanda, where the Belgians created the Hutus and the Tutsis and then separated them out. They're the ones that set up the tension in the first place. It didn't even exist beforehand. All right, and then the physical geography of Africa and its impact on trade. So, of course, they do have a lot of access to the ocean. Problem is, a lot of the coastline is a cliff and stuff, so it's really not that easily accessible throughout a lot of it. And then when you get to sub-Saharan Africa, they really were separated from trade quite a bit. Except in East Africa, you could trade with India and other parts of Asia. But in Western Africa, sub-Saharan Africa on the west side, there just wasn't as much contact with outside groups. And so they developed slower as far as technology goes compared to Northern Africa, which had contact there with Europe. So obviously the Sahara is a large barrier. It's basically a wall that separated sub-Saharan Africa from other parts of the world and kept them from advancing at the rate that the other parts of the world were advancing at. All right, and then, of course, understanding why people do cash crops. Like if they're starving, and then why are they farming? When they farm, why are they growing cash crops? And the answer is because they make more money. And so that's just what it comes down to. And then they grow a little bit of food just for themselves to be able to eat. But of course, that creates a problem with this growing population and more people moving to cities not having enough to eat. And then, of course, there's going to be several maps and charts and a couple of vignettes to read as well. And then apartheid in South Africa. So we talked about how that was separation of the races in South Africa between whites and blacks. So the big difference with South Africa compared to the United States when it comes to segregation was that in South Africa, it was the minority ruling over the majority, and it was very harsh. And so, of course, it was horrible here in the U.S. It was even worse in South Africa, and did not end until 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela. So after he became president, it ended at that point. But, of course, if you just think about like the U.S. and racial issues that still exist here in the U.S., just because apartheid ended in 1994, that doesn't mean that their race issues ended in 1994. Those are going to continue on. Just like here in the U.S., it's something that has to continually be faced and improved upon over time. All right, and then also the infrastructure that the Europeans built in Africa as they colonized Africa. Keep in mind that this infrastructure was only to get access to the raw materials that they were looking for. So they didn't care to build roads and hospitals and schools and stuff for Africans just to benefit Africans. They were only building things that helped them reach the things they were trying to get for themselves. All right, and then more about the ethnic groups and the ethnic breakdown of Africa. A little bit more on apartheid. Also remember, too, with apartheid in the 1980s, the United States and the UK, we put economic sanctions on South Africa to help pressure them to end apartheid, which played a key role because that pretty much ruined their economy at that point. All right, and then, of course, you should know the significance of the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal in Egypt connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, which connects to the Indian Ocean. So that allowed England to get to India much quicker instead of going around Africa. So still today, that is a very important strategic waterway that we need access to. Our military uses it to get over to the Persian Gulf and that area around the Middle East. All right, let's see here. And then generally the climates in Africa, so like I said, most of it's in the tropics. For the most part, you do have Mediterranean climate along the Mediterranean, obviously, in far northern Africa. Of course, obviously, there's not going to be tundra or anything like that. There's no really cold areas whatsoever in Africa. All right, several more charts. It just takes me a second to skim through it and see if there's anything I need to say. Also, keep in mind with the genocides we looked at, like with Rwanda and the one in Darfur in Sudan, you have it's always around a civil war. So you got two groups within a country fighting each other like a traditional war, but then you've got this militia, whether it's the Janjaweed in Sudan or the Interahamwe in Rwanda, that are fighting against a particular group of people trying to kill them. So just keep that in mind that you got a normal civil war going on, but within that you have a militia that's going around killing a certain group of people, trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. All right, and then going back to like vegetation zones and stuff like that and biomes. So a big area in Africa, kind of central east side of Africa, around Kenya and that region, is savanna. So the savanna is where you're going to see your lions and giraffes and elephants and all that kind of stuff. It's a grassland like ours, except it's drier because we live in a grassland, if you didn't know. But it's just drier there than it is here. Kind of looks similar to like Kansas or something if you've been there. Sure. And then the natural resources in Africa. We talked about how Africa is very rich in natural resources. It's actually the richest continent when it comes to natural resources like gold, diamonds, and oil and things like that. And so the reason why they haven't really been able to benefit from it, as far as economically benefit, is because of course, poor governments and things like that, unstable governments. The fact that they're still basically in a colonial relationship with Europe and the United States. So even though they're free countries, they still mine out their own natural resources and give them to Europe and the United States. I say give them, sell them. And then we make the finished products with it. So still, we're benefiting more off their resources than they do, still to this day. All right, and then as far as why democracy really hasn't taken root yet in Africa, I mean, part of it's because they didn't have a history of it. I mean, there's no history of democracy in Africa, so there's no system for them to really emulate from that. And then also too, after Europe gave freedom to these African countries, they just kind of would pick a person and put them in control. And so, I mean, if you think about it, for hundreds of years, all they saw from Europe is pretty much direct control and no freedom and stuff like that. And so that's the system they know and grew up with, in a sense. And so whenever they start ruling themselves, that's what they're going to emulate. They're going to emulate what they saw. And so it's not until today, and over the last, several decades, where they've been able to see, into each other's backyards, in a sense, and see other countries and how they run the freedoms that we have, and then start bringing that to their countries within Africa. So today, democracy is spreading, and it's spreading pretty well throughout the region, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a very good thing. And then looking at the Columbian Exchange, so the Columbian Exchange generally deals with everything else besides slavery. So obviously you had the Atlantic slave trade during that time period, but the Columbian Exchange were other goods that were transported between the continents. And so there was things from Africa that never made it over here to the U.S. as well that came during that time. And, of course, slaves. All right, and then in South Africa, going back to apartheid again. So even though apartheid has ended, there's still a huge economic gap between blacks and whites in South Africa. And so you still see majority of blacks in poverty and stuff like that, which, again, is similar to here in the U.S. I mean, the poverty rate among African Americans is much higher than it is among white Americans. And so you still see the after effects of segregation and stuff like that on society in South Africa. All right, and then a couple maps, a couple charts. And so again, going back to the governments in Africa, as far as what type of governments you'll find throughout the region, you're going to find both governments that... Hold on. You're going to find governments that both limit freedom and governments that allow citizen participation. So they're both throughout Africa. And then, let's see. And then last thing, just the Nile River. So it's the longest river in the world, and just know it flows north, coming out of Lake Victoria, and then goes up through Sudan, and then up through Egypt, and then of course empties up into the Mediterranean. So most of the Egyptians live along the Nile River Delta in northern Egypt, next to the Mediterranean Sea. All right, and that's it for Africa. If you have any questions, of course, come in and let me know, or shoot me an email, or come by in the morning before the test.